So I'm going to run through the PSMT guidelines with you now. There are two groups of people sitting in here. If you're doing math methods, you should have a PSMT that you received today that is about a volleyball situation. If you're doing general maths, you should have a PSMT you received today about buying a car. That's my understanding. So I'm not going to... Well done, you made it a minute. I'm not going to talk about the context or the specific PSMTs. What I'm going to talk to you about today is the expectations on your response for the PSMT that QCAA have provided us through the criteria sheet that you'll have in front of you. I'll get to that progressively. There's a fair bit to go through. I want to give you as much detail as possible. Anything that I talk about today, you can follow up on. So if I can make this as clear as possible, you will do 3 PSMTs before you, well, you'll do 2 PSMTs before you do your actual Year 12 PSMT, the one that counts towards your ATAR. It's worth 20% of your ATAR. And if you listen now and if you practice and you take on board the feedback, you can easily walk out of that PSMT with 18, 19 or 20 out of 20. There's a criteria there, there's a way to do it, and we can give you those marks. But you need to make sure that you're taking on the feedback and you're doing the things that we tell you to do and that the criteria sheet tell you to do. So that's the aim. You'll have 2 practice runs. The first run is this one. We can give you a lot of help. So you've got it today, it's due in exactly 4 weeks. In 2 weeks' time, you will have a double lesson in class to work on your PSMT and you will submit your PSMT progress check. When you submit your PSMT progress check, it will go on OneNote and your teacher will provide you some feedback. We're trialling a couple of feedback options to make it a little bit more efficient for us and to provide you more feedback, and you'll hear more about that later on. But that's going to happen this time. That will not happen so much in the future. In Year 12, we aren't actually allowed to give you that much detailed feedback. We can give you some general feedback, but not a lot of detailed feedback. So take on the feedback now, ask the questions now. There is a chance that a question you might ask now that we can help you with, if you ask that in Year 12, we can't help you with it. So you've got to make sure you ask your questions, you understand the situation now. Okay? So let's just start running through this. If you have questions during the presentation, you're more than welcome to ask me, and I'll try and help you. But otherwise, I'll give you some time at the end to ask me questions as well. Might just move this across. Okay. So, first of all, what is the PSMT? So the PSMT is short for Problem Solving and Modelling Task, and we'll be using the PSMT acronym. And it's basically should just be a single question in a single context. You'll find, again, as we progress along that scale of going from a Year 10 PSMT to Year 12 PSMT, it becomes that single question in context. It will seem very open-ended. It will seem to you like it's not really a math question, and that's the way it should be. There's going to be a lot of problems with it every time. They're called assumptions, and I'll get to those a little bit later. It should be open-ended. There should be lots of different directions you can go in. That's the idea of the PSMT. So if it feels open-ended, that's what it should be. The Year 10 one is actually a little bit more closed than the ones you'll get next year. So that's the PSMT. So here's some examples of simple ones, things that we're starting to bring into junior secondary, and you'll know Ms. Beforth does a lot of this kind of stuff anyway, in terms of PSMTs. So we could just go into, and we've done this now, into a Year 7 class and say how many blades of grass are there in the oval? And that's a PSMT. It's a problem solving and modelling task. Okay, there is no constraints to that. And as you could imagine, everybody in here could go and do that problem and come up with a different answer, and they could all be reasonably correct. So that's the idea, and there's a couple more examples on there as well, and obviously you could probably think of more. So on the side here is a problem-solving flowchart. You should have seen this in Year 9 last year. It's gone up in classrooms. Should be in your Year 10 classroom as well. This is what QCAA are using to guide problem-solving. And this concept is not unique here. There's lots of different problem-solving and modelling flowcharts, but this one in particular follows your criteria sheet. So if you do have your PSMT task in front of you, you'll notice that the criteria follows this. There is a formulate criteria. So the first thing that you do is you formulate the problem. You read it and you formulate how you're going to approach this problem. What things don't you know that you need to know? What questions do you need to ask, for example? The second thing is to solve the problem. So then you go ahead, you do the mathematics to solve the problem. The third part is to evaluate and verify. That's where you look at your solution and you think, is this a good solution? Are there issues with my solutions? Could I refine my solution? And if there is some issues with your solution, and I'll give you a hint now, it's quite nice if there is. It makes it easier for us to give you good marks for evaluate and verify if you identify issues and then go back to the start and refine your solution. So say, I could have done it better if I did this, and you go back through that process again. Once you're happy with your solution and your evaluate and verify is ticked off, then we get to the communicate bit at the bottom. It kind of happens throughout, but your communicate bit will be just wrapping up the task. It includes the introduction, conclusion, and you make sure you communicated your solution as well as possible. So that's the problem-solving flowchart. Your teachers might talk about that. It's up in the classrooms as well. So refer to it, and it's a really good framework for you to use in terms of building your solution to follow that framework. Here's something you'll probably find important, and again, you may have talked about this a little bit. How are your problem-solving and modelling tasks marked? So you'll get a mark out of 20. It's not going to be a percentage that gets scaled down. It's a criteria-based mark out of 20, and those 4 criteria from the last page are what the things that are marked. So formulate is out of 4, solve is out of 7, evaluate and verify is out of 5, and communicate is out of 4. If you add those up, it's out of 20. In Year 12, that mark out of 20 just gets added up to you with your exams to give you a final math methods or general maths ATAR mark. So that's how it gets marked, and it gets marked based on that criteria. So make sure that you're following the criteria as you go. And here are the criteria. So I'm going to run through these quickly, but I'm going to expand on these a little bit later on. I apologise now if it gets a little bit dull, but there's some really important language that you need to be aware of. So first of all, this is the formulate criteria, and it has a couple of really important things to it. The third dot point is the accurate translation of all aspects of the problem by identifying mathematical concepts and techniques. It's a really easy dot point to tick off. If you do the solve thing in a reasonable manner, that's probably done. The only thing you really need to do on top of that is make sure that you specifically make mention of the mathematical concepts and techniques that you use. If you make that really clear and obvious so that when your teacher's marking it, they can see it and say, okay, I can see they've done that, I can see they've done that, then you'll get full marks for that criteria. The assumptions and observations I will come back to. I've got a separate section for that, so I'll come back to that. And you'll notice here that to get a 3 or a 4, you need to document your assumptions and observations. To get a 1 or 2, you just need to state your assumptions and observations. I'm going to talk to you about the difference between those, but I'll do it in a minute. I've got a separate section for it. Solve, the solve criteria is out of 7. This is the most important. This is really the maths, which if you flip that around, it means that 13 out of 20 of the marks are for the communication and for the way you present and for the way you explain things. Only 7 marks are actually really for the maths. So just keep that in mind. So as you run through this, don't worry about 1 or 0. There is a stream here, a dot point stream on technology. So we'd like to see you using technology. So for general maths, there's probably going to be a reliance there on you using good spreadsheeting techniques. If you have got any problems with spreadsheets, now's a good time to talk to your teacher about that. If you've got questions about it, spreadsheets are really powerful and can do a lot. They will be really helpful. For math method, you're going to find that you will probably be using Desmos a lot, possibly spreadsheets as well. And there's also going to be an element of either using your graphics calculator, using an online solver, and for both classes there'll be good word processing skills as well. So that's going to be your technology. Application of mathematical concepts and techniques relevant to the task, and in addition to that, for the 6 or 7 mark, discerning application. So there's not a huge difference. If you do a lot of stuff, and you will have seen this probably in English when you're writing essays, if you're working on this dot point and you just throw everything at it, then that will definitely be an application of mathematical concepts and techniques, but it might not be discerning. Discerning will mean to choose appropriate things and to not overdo it, to make the right selection. Which for me, when I was at school in English, that's the bit I found hard. I could come up with good arguments, but I couldn't pick out the best ones to put in, and I'd overdo it. So you've got to be careful. Discerning is going to be picking the best mathematical techniques to use and not doing the other stuff to try and cover all your bases if you want to hit that discerning. Accurate use of complex procedures, you'll see that scales down as well. So that's the top dot point. complex procedures, and then this top dot point of the 4 to 5 strand is use of complex procedures, not necessarily accurate, you might have some mistakes in there, and then down the next 2 to 3, the top dot point is use of simple procedures. So as you go through, think about the things you're learning in class and try and make sure that you're using the appropriate procedures. And that doesn't mean that if you're doing quadratic modelling for math methods that you have to go and find an even better way of modelling the volleyball motion. You just have to use the quadratic modelling model because that is what you've been taught, and that's a complex procedure. And the same with the general maths, you've just got to use appropriate spreadsheeting to build appropriate budgets and bring in all of the important aspects into your calculations. That will be complex procedures. You don't have to overdo that. And again, you can get guidance from your teachers there. Evaluate and verify criteria looks like this. And I'm going to talk about a lot of these things. We have the top dot point is about your reasonableness, evaluation of the reasonableness, and then for the 2 to 3 strand is statements about the reasonableness. So if you just put in some dot points and say, my model is reasonable because dot point, dot point, dot point, they're statements. And I'll talk to you about the difference between stating and documenting in a moment. Evaluation of the reasonableness by considering results, assumptions, and observations for the top strand. Documentation of relevant strengths and limitations, I'll talk about that. And justifications of decisions made using mathematical reasoning, I'll talk a bit more about that as well. That's probably the easiest one to hit there. Again, if you do a full solution and it's comprehensive, you'll probably find that every time you make a decision, every time you choose the mathematical concept to use, as long as you talk about why you're making that choice, you've hit that justification of decisions. And that's all there in your task. Communication, 2 dot points. One of them is appropriate mathematical, statistical and everyday language, conventions, etc. And also organisation of response, appropriate genre, all that type of stuff. So it really, you have to make sure that you avoid grammatical spelling errors. If there's a few in there, that's not going to affect you. If there's a lot, that could affect you. So you just got to be careful of that. And it has to be organised, easy to follow. You are going to want to use titles, subtitles, split things up appropriately. Try not to split things over pages if you can avoid them, stuff like that. So we'll move on to the criteria now. Hopefully it'll be a little bit more interesting as we move forward now. Assumptions and observations. So I will, this PowerPoint will be available on Passmark for you. This will be a really important slide for you to go back to. We've spent a lot of time thinking about how we present this, and this is what we've come up with. An observation is something you notice is important for solving the problem. So for example, with the blades of grass on the oval, if you walk out in the oval and you notice that part of the oval looks like it's actually quite sparse in terms of grass, or there's some brown patches, or there's some dirt patches, that is an observation that's going to have an effect on your solution. Then we make an assumption based on that observation. So your observations and assumptions will often come in pairs and be linked together, not always, but often. So then you might make the assumption that I'm going to assume that all the grass is evenly green, or you might say something like, looks to me like 20% of the oval is a lot more sparse, so I'm going to do a scaling factor based on that, or whatever it is that your solution is. So that's how we deal with an observation, and then we create an assumption that links to that observation. And there's some examples there you can read through when you have a look at this. Here's another important slide on observations and assumptions, and this is relevant for any time that documenting versus stating comes up. So this is directly from QCAA's cognitive verbs definitions, and you'll see here that the cognitive verb for document is to support with evidence. There's some stuff in brackets there because they're trying to make it relevant for a lot of different subject areas, but the main premise here is to support with evidence. So if we're talking about reasonableness or assumptions or strengths and limitations, and you state something that you think is important to say, and you say it, that's a statement. As soon as you provide some evidence for that, it becomes documented. That's the difference. So you have to be thinking in terms of, what do I need to say, and what is the evidence behind what I need to say? And make sure that you've got that. Now, you've got a 10-page limit, and I'll get to those important things a little bit later on. It's quite hard to work within that limit. And there are some students who are currently in Year 11 who found it hard. So you've got to keep that in mind. So we will give you documenting assumptions and observations, documenting strengths and limitations, all that kind of stuff. You don't have to document all of them. But if you document 2 or 3 of the important ones, you provide reasoning for the really important ones or the ones that have a larger effect, then you will get that criteria mark. So just make sure that you've done it to some of them. Does anyone have any questions on that or anything so far? Okay, strengths and limitations. So this one's sort of easy and hard. It's easy to get the base mark here. You just talk about your model. And for those of you who are not sure what I mean when we're talking about the model, for the general maths student, your model is probably going to be the development of your budget. So how much money you're bringing in, how much money you have outgoing, how much money you have left over to buy a car, and you've now built a mathematical model to help you buy a car. So the strengths and limitations of your model will be, your strengths will be talking about, well, what other things could happen? What things am I missing? What could change the situation? If there's a lot of things there, then that's a limitation. If you've managed to incorporate most of the costs that could possibly come up, then that's a strength, and you need to think in that respect. For math methods, your model is probably actually going to be the quadratic model you use to map the path of the volleyball. So when you're starting to talk about that, you will have a function that will be your mathematical model. So there's a bit of a difference there, but ultimately the mathematical model is the mathematics behind developing a solution. And you have to talk about the strengths there. They may arise from a lot of things. Visual solution may provide you with some indication of strengths and limitations. Your numerical results, and you might get variability in your numerical results, may provide that. Your assumptions and observations also come in here. The procedures that you use may provide you with strengths and limitations, etc., etc. So you probably won't start with your strengths and limitations. You're going to do a lot of the maths before you really worry about that too much. But when you get to that point where you've done a lot of the maths, you need to take a step back and think, is my model really strong? Is it accurate? Will it always work? Is there anything that could affect it? And that's where you're going to get your strengths and limitations from. You'll also need to talk about your reasonableness. So this is evaluate and verify again, different dot point. So based on your strengths and limitations, discuss the reasonableness of your model. So again, if I just quickly talk about the general PSMT, if you build a financial budget based on the fact that you've got $2,000 a week coming in and you're spending $500 a week on groceries and that's all you do, that's a really unreasonable model. And your reasonableness will come directly from the fact that your strengths and limitations in that situation should be, I've got a significant number of limitations. Here are the things that might happen with my money. This. Then I have a pretty unreasonable model. And then at that point, you should be going back and refining your model. So your reasonableness will tack on straight onto the back of strengths and limitations, and will be a discussion of that, almost like a summary. And this is specific language. So if you want your teacher to spot those important things, then use that specific language. So this is where you go, reasonableness of model, subtitle, and you put that in. And you say, my model is reasonable because. Just use that really specific language. I'm just on to talking about the finer points now. So stop me if you have any of those specific questions. These are the finer points for you. And again, you'll get this information. So you have some layout constraints. It's a 10-page task. QCAA have said it has to be under 10 pages at year 12. If you provide us an 11-page document, we can see it, but when we submit that to QCAA, the program cuts it off at 10 pages. So we will be marking only the 10 pages. So that means you have to stick with size 11 Calibri. That is, we've chosen that because if you open up a Word document, that's what it's set at. Unless you change something on your laptop, that's what it's set at. We don't want you changing it to size 4 so you can give us a 40-page assignment in 10 pages. That's not the point. Margins, again, that's standard margins, 10 pages, word count 2,000. If anything, if you are efficient and effective, it's probably too much for the year 10 task, but it does become, the scope widens a little bit in year 11 and 12. Use graphs and images. If you use an image that you didn't create, you have to reference that. If you create a graph or an image, a graph, for example, if you create a graph for the math methods task, it doesn't need to be a whole page. Be reasonable, don't make it too small, don't make it too big. As a guideline, I'd say a quarter to a third of a page is about right for most graphs. So consider that as you're working on this. Avoid, there we go, full page graphs, etc. Language and readability, use the language of the topic, task sheet and criteria. So refer to that task sheet. You should have a subtitle that says strengths and limitations. Again, it's going to sound a bit like I'm trying to make our job easy, but you're going to do better if you make our job easy. If we can see where you've met every criteria, we can give you maximum marks easy. Yep.
Are strengths and limitations in a table?
They could be in a table, but just be a bit... Tables kind of... It's a maths assignment, so you can use dot points in tables whenever you want, pretty much. But you have to be a little bit careful because tables tend to make people feel like just create statements and not explain. So I've seen most of the time people write a paragraph, which is harder for us to work through, but people tend to be better at writing explanations in paragraphs. People put a table in and they think, oh, I just need to make one sentence in each box, and then they don't explain. So you just got to be a bit careful with that. But definitely, a table is a good way to make it easier for us to mark as well. Access and use cognitive verbs. They are, the last time I checked, on the Year 10 Passmark courses. So you can use those. There's not that many that you'll need to worry about, but access and use them as you need to. Again, this is a maths assignment, so there is a bit of ambiguity. It's an open task, but again, you will create a specific response. So make sure it's really specific how you're saying what you need to say. If possible, write your task in the third person, and I think that potentially could be done. It's not such a big problem in Year 10, but by the time we get to Year 12, it does make things a bit easier for you. Use titles and signposts when you address certain criteria, so that's what I'm saying about subtitling. It's really going to make your life a lot easier and our life a lot easier, and you might actually find that the best thing to do is to go home and the first part of your thing is to create a page that has introduction and then assumptions and observations and then collection of data and then solutions. Create your subtitles and use that as a plan and then start filling in the gaps. Is definitely an approach that I've seen some of the Year 11s use and they've done it quite well. Your assignment should include an introductory body and conclusion. So your introduction and probably your conclusion, generally speaking, pretty much don't earn you any marks, except they do contribute towards your communication mark. So they should be there, 2, maybe 3 sentences each, just to round up the assignment, and that is part of the writing it in an appropriate genre. So the second dot point in the communication mark. Go down to the last page, possibly. I know we've got one more after this. Submission of work. So there's a couple of things here. We're going to collect work more frequently in Year 10, 11 and 12 on the assignment type stuff. So you'll have checkpoint 1, checkpoint 2 and a final submission. And at all of those points we expect you to submit to pass mark. So expect that to happen. You'll get that guidance from your teacher, exactly when they're due and what you need to do. Checkpoint 1 submission, we're also going to trial you putting that through your section of the OneNote, the relevant OneNote, and then your teacher will provide you feedback in your section of the OneNote. So we'll be asking you to do that, and you'll get lesson time on that day. So we'll be making you do that in that lesson time. If you're away, you still need to do that. So obviously, if you're away and you're sick, there's things in place to have extensions, etc. So you're welcome to do that. But the best bet is for you to submit what you've got, particularly at the progress check stage, and then you'll get the feedback in an appropriate time frame. So I'll still be trying to do that. First 2 checkpoints, Dropbox and Passmark. Final submission will require you to submit through Turnitin and submit a hard copy with a task sheet. So just make sure that you've prepared yourself for that, and that will be due at 4 p.m. on the due date. So you've got to make sure that the hard copy with the task sheet is handed in at the right time, or any time on that day. Second last page, this one. Key tips, and I've already referred to a couple of these. Use headings to signpost your task. Apply key content language, cognitive verb language, and language using the task sheet. Label all your diagrams and refer to the labels. So if you draw a graph, call it graph 1. And then refer to graph 1 as you're talking about it. So it's really, again, make it as easy as possible for your teachers. It really, really helps. And lastly, again, it's not specifically an English task, so we're not looking for perfect persuasive writing or anything like that, but you can make it easy, and I would be happy if every single person in this room started with this report aims to. It's the exemplars that QCAA have provided us do pretty much exactly that. It's a good way to start. It makes it clear what you're trying to do. It's a good introduction. The The report should be able to be read independently of the task sheet. Keep that in mind as well. That's another point that's been made and brought to us by QCAA. We shouldn't have to refer to the task sheet. Your teacher will be familiar with that. But I should be able to give that, your task, to anybody in the teaching staff, and they should be able to read it and make sense of what you've done and why you've done it. So keep that in mind in the back of your mind as well. Answer the problem and make your answer clear. And here's my last page, which is a conclusion. You've got 4 lessons to work on your assignment. That's a QCAA expectation as well, so 3 hours in total. So you'll get that. Your teacher will tell you when those lessons will be. Your teacher will check your work at the progress checks. 2 weeks in is your first progress check, so I'd be aiming to get as much done as possible by then. You'll get the best feedback. You should be able to finish, I think, easily within 10 hours. Most of Year 11 students felt that was pretty much true. Some complained to me about that statement, but I would actually argue that if you can't finish it in 10 hours, then you maybe need to look at how you focus when you're doing things like this. So, and how you approach that. So, for my part, that tells me mathematically that if you do 2 to 3 hours per week and you've got that 3 hour class time, you're finished in 2.5 weeks to 3 weeks. That should be your aim. The last week should just be polishing things up. If you get 2 to 3 hours done this week, next week, or in the next 2 weeks, and a bit of class time, you're presenting something that's 75% done in your progress check, you get the best feedback. That's what you need to do. And I got a very large range of feedback of progress checks last year, and the people that gave me complete or almost complete progress checks got better feedback and did better overall. Lastly, this is your first PSMT. We can help you a lot. So please ask questions now, particularly on the criteria sheet if you don't understand it. If you don't understand volleyball, that's not going to help you a great deal with your PSMT in Year 11 or Year 12. But if you don't understand the criteria sheet, that will help you moving forward. And we have to drop that support off. When you get into Year 12, there's not as much help we can give you, and I can't stress that enough. And particularly as I'm not a Year 10 teacher, I'm more than happy for you to pester your teachers as much as you possibly want. So that's it. Thank you. Does anybody have any other questions?